Besides my Economic Policy Institute hat, I wear the co-chair of the Americans for Tax Fairness Coalition hat, which I'm very proud of. So while I have the platform, I want to say a few substantive things before I introduce one of my heroes. First, I'm not really ready to have policy discussions without first acknowledging that we're talking about a qualitatively different type of transition to power by somebody who's going to criminalize immigrants, scare people, profile people of color, discriminate by religion, and undercut our civil liberties. This is not a normal transition, and we can't treat it like that. I have much more than policy differences with this crowd. I've committed myself to saying that every time I can. A few comments on the tax fight ahead and corporate tax reform. You can take it for what it's worth from a labor market economist, not a tax economist, but I do talk to tax economists. First of all, the promise of a revenue-neutral corporate tax reform is, that it's attractive is a complete myth. That can't happen. It won't ever happen unless there's deep revenue cuts. We want revenue increases. That's even less likely. Let me explain why. And this is just a look at history. I have not seen a proposal from any business group for corporate tax reform. They have never sat down around the table and decided whose tax is going to go up and whose tax is going to go down. Now, if they can't propose one, how are we going to have the Congress do it that's going to work? If it were possible, then Dave Camp would be a much more famous chair of the Ways and Means Committee, and his proposal would have made much more progress. But it didn't, and it hardly even got business saluting it. So, to me, revenue-neutral corporate tax reform is something that policy wonks favor, but it has no constituency. I also want to challenge the policy wonks a little bit on it, and which is, I'm not sure we should even believe that revenue-neutral corporate tax reform would have much of an economic impact worth spending a lot of time fighting for. Now, the point has been made earlier that lowering the statutory rate matters. How much it matters, I'm a skeptic. But revenue-neutral corporate tax reform means that for every firm or sector where the tax rate goes down, there's another of equal revenue size where the tax rate goes up. So whatever economic benefit you get from the marginal changes in one will be offset by the other, except to the extent that the statutory rate matters. And I'm not so sure that that goal is all that worth pursuing. So shifting from that, we're about to have a big tax fight. Not sure how you fight something that's in reconciliation. But we're about to see large tax cuts. Again, this is round 3 or 4 in my career. I just want to ask one thing, and that is we don't fight these tax cuts or make the first talking point that they raise the deficit. Nobody gives a darn. Republicans don't give a darn. when they run for office, when they govern. Democrats, we just had a whole campaign where the Clinton campaign was studiously getting the budget deficit hawks to sign off on her proposals to assure everybody that she wouldn't raise the deficit. Whoopee. That really helped. I don't want to demonize deficits. People have an outsized view of what they mean, and they don't, we haven't taught people Keynesian economics. The reality is that we could have tax cuts this year that, because they do raise the deficit, actually will create a bunch of jobs. I think the idea that the new policies are going to lead to a recession and are necessarily going to be bad. I mean, listen, Ronald Reagan had a remarkable recovery and ran on Morning in America in 1984, and he did it on what we used to call military Keynesianism. And so I ask the progressive community, we should fight it. There's lots of ways to fight the taxes. We're giving money to people that don't need it. We're going to give money to people who are least likely to spend it. You know, it's unlikely in the long run to have much of effect on growth, I think, and very little effect on wages. We know that there's been a 40-year divergence between productivity and wages of the median worker. In the long run, just getting growth without doing things to make sure growth translates to most people is the sound of one hand clapping, in my view. Okay? So there, I'll get off my pontifying. Thank you. So, just to say a few words about Congressman Levin. As I've gotten older, I've stopped having old friends. I have longtime friends. Congressman Levin is a longtime hero and a longtime friend. It's unusual to have someone so thoughtful and studious, knowledgeable, and a real policy wonk that's a committee chair and a member of Congress. To couple that with somebody who's humble, warm, and a true mensch is quite delightful. Add in someone who's a passionate fighter, and you really get a nice troika. And that's exactly the kind of person Congressman Levin is. We're really lucky that he also managed to accumulate a ton of seniority, and really appreciate that puts him in a position to be a leader in the fights ahead on taxes, on trade, and other things that really matter. And with that, introduce Congressman Sandy Levin.
Thank you very much. Well, after that, what is there to say? But I'll say a few words. And thank you for inviting me. The staff's here. Karen especially, who works on taxes, Hillary and Daniel, Chief of Staff, and who works on Daniel on communications. Let me just start off by saying what I think is really in play here, what's at stake. The president at one point said that the president-elect is pragmatic. It's more that he's pragmatic than ideological. I wouldn't have put it that way. Because I think, well, Donald Trump, the president-elect, is pragmatic in some respects. I do think there's some real ideology there. And I think everybody should understand that. And when the vice president said that everything will be in good hands. I think that was in order to be polite, as you need to be to the Vice President-elect. But I think the danger is that everything will not be in good hands. And in fact, already we see signs of that. And that's true in terms of tax policy. And so what Larry said is so true. And I think there's an obligation of everybody, including economists, to really be far more active than they were when Dave Camp's proposal came out. Because right away the notion was it wasn't going anywhere, and it did not. But it's different now, and tax reform and tax issues are real. And the speaker may be pragmatic, and we have had a cordial relationship, but Paul Ryan is ideological. And his view is helping to drive where tax reform appears to be going. And everybody has an obligation to get involved. I'll be brief, but just a few indications of where it's going. The proposal is the GOP better way, and again, there may be some modifications in it. 3/4 of the tax cuts would benefit the top 1% of taxpayers. And everybody should understand, take that seriously, because it's not somebody's whimsical notion. It's part of the ideology. I understand there was earlier some discussion here about the estate tax. There may be a few cases where farms could not change hands. We've always asked people to come forth, and rarely have we had more than 1 or 2 incidents where the estate tax that our proposal would have led to hardship there. We're talking about $270 billion over 10 years. That's a lot of money. Also, as you know, they are proposing that what would apply to corporations would apply to pass-throughs. And it is complicated to do that and to try to avoid abuse and having moved from one form to another in order to get a lower tax. I've spent a lot of time on corporate tax reform. I think there needs to be a lower tax rate, but it needs to be in a framework that makes sense. The inversion issue, which we tried to spotlight, and the Treasury took some steps, is a serious issue. Tax havens have multiplied, and when Europe took steps to try to respond, I think too much so the answer was, well, they're taking money that should come to us, and there is that aspect. And I'm not sure what was being proposed in Europe was consistent with their own rules, especially the retroactivity part of it. The administration, at our urging, took some steps on earnings stripping. When you look at what's happened in the international tax field, it's ridden with abuse. Tax havens have very much taken over much of the tax code, and it's hard to keep track of them. So we need to take seriously where this is going. The likelihood is it's basically going to be more of the same in terms of individual, in terms of equity. And the notion is that it will promote growth. We've been through that before. And this country's economy suffered desperately because of the mistake of thinking that if you have top-down tax reform, that it will lead to massive economic growth. And so there's some doubt even in their own ranks that that will happen. And so what's now occurring is the use of dynamic scoring. And those of you who are economists and others of you who have some expertise have to help us understand what this phenomenon is really all about and what its implications are. The Joint Tax Committee is wrestling with this, and I think they're trying to be objective, but there's immense pressure on the Joint Tax Committee to try to utilize dynamic scoring to make up for huge gaps. And we need to be very much on our toes. Let me say just a word about infrastructure, because there are new proposals. And it's very true that we have massive infrastructure needs in this country. They've been underestimated. And it's not only highways and bridges. As we saw in Flint, it's the entire infrastructure of this country is very outdated, dangerously so. And there's more and more evidence that lead poisoning is not limited to Flint. And so there is this massive need, and the attraction, and as someone who once represented construction workers, it's true that one way to promote economic growth, and a rather sure way, if it's done correctly, is through money for infrastructure. However, how it's done is also important. And you need to try to make sense out of some of the proposals that are coming forth. Because the notice that you're going to have huge bonding, et cetera, that there'll be some down and the rest in tax credits, all of that needs to be challenged. And that's being done because there's a complete unwillingness to increase the gas tax. So everything else is attempted because of the unwillingness to step up to that. So let me just say a word about deficits, if I might. I think it's true that now both Republicans and Democrats, to some extent, for different reasons, I think, want to minimize the impact of deficits. And I think it's true that in Europe there was an unwillingness to utilize deficit spending to promote economic growth. And I think we were wise in this country to follow a different course. And there's an argument that the stimulus package wasn't enough of it. People should remember we tried. And there was immense resistance from those, especially Republicans, who talked about the danger of deficits. So I think we need to be forthright about this, and we need to be have some debate. I think we need to be wary, though, that there is an easy coming together of of Keynesian Democrats and whatever they are, neo-Keynesian Republicans. I'm not sure how to describe them. Because I think, there's some estimate of the Republican bill. One was, $6 trillion in added deficits. And another reason we need to be careful about that is because what the Republicans really want to do is to make up for deficits to some extent by cutting essential programs. And maybe I'll finish with this in terms of essential programs. And my staff is here. We had a meeting in Michigan a couple months ago with people who were working on issues of hunger in higher education. And I was astonished how large universities and colleges and community colleges in the state of Michigan are wrestling with the problem that students coming to higher education are coming in need of food. And so I had to press people, is this real? I understood that now in so many schools in my district and throughout this country, teachers have food in their desks. And now this is widespread through the suburban district that I represent. And I think we should expect, when there are analyses of these tax programs, that part of the effort is going to be to go after programs and engage in massive cuts. And I'm not afraid of looking at them carefully. I'm afraid of the wild acts. And we're going to see more of this, for example, in proposals relating to Medicaid and to block grant it. And you can block grant it and save money. I'm not sure it will happen because I don't think it's understood that about half of Medicaid money, more or less, goes for long-term care. And Medicaid is a major source of long-term care in this country. So you're going to hit not only poor families, but a lot of middle-income families if you try to make up a lot of the gap that exists because of tax reform by cutting necessary social programs. But there is that danger, and it has happened before. And so I come here with a plea, and that is, and Larry spelled it out, I think he felt the need to do this. This is not the usual transition. I'm all in favor of politeness and goodwill. I'm also in favor of wishing the best. I'm also in favor of cooperating where possible. But what we're seeing, I think, is a potential and a likely sea change when it comes to how you approach tax reform and all of the implications of tax reform, all of the substance of tax reform, and all of the fallout from tax reform that is awry. And so I think all of you who belong to organizations that are dedicated to studying this need to accelerate your efforts, because in so many cases, I must say, when we have dealt with these important tax and tax-related issues, there have been some organizations that have been very active, but there hasn't been enough investment of time and talent to help us in the Congress. We don't have a bevy of economists. We have some, but we don't have huge resources within our ranks, especially when we're in the minority. I would alarm you if I told you the number of economists that we have within our ranks. It's small. And so we're going to rely on those on the outside to pitch in and to try to help us make sense. And I'll finish with this. Also to describe it in a way that connects with the public, that really gets us away from kind of the stereotypical approaches to tax reform and its impact. And not only talk about trickle down and not only talk about this and that, but to really try to describe what the likely impact is in the lives of so many people if this is in the wrong place. And look, I mean, I think we may reach agreement on some EITC change. But that's not nearly enough. And I don't want that to mask the basic problems of where this new president and it appears the majority in the Congress are going. Because it is a real danger to the kind of equity and the kind of growth that I think most of you believe in, and that's so essential for this nation. So that's a bit of a sober message, but what else? I love good cheer, but you can't make good recipes out of good cheer. So, thank you for inviting me, and I hope that your meeting will be a harbinger of a lot of deep involvement and immersal in the debate ahead, because it's going to have major economic impacts both on growth and equity. And we are both, all of us, determined in this country to achieve both. Thank you very much.